Looks good. Looks like all systems are optimal here. Let's see. Let's lock that window down. Also, let's lock the window down. We're good on fuel, it looks like. Let's turn game audio up. Alright, looks like we're good there. We could be a little bit louder in the mic. Pause that. That's not what we wanted at all. There we go. Let's see. Did I make it happen? Yes. Turn my volume up. All right, looks like we're good. Let's check in with, I don't know where. Un momento, por favor. There we go. Push that there. Looks like we're good. All right, let's check in with Echo.
Welcome back. What's on your mind?
Hey, Echo. So the last time we were on our way to Bernard's Loop. We still are on our way to Bernard's Loop. Can you give me a status check on the ship? How are the systems running right now?
You're headed to Bernard's Loop? Epic. Let's imagine the ship's systems are all green. Engines, shields, life support, everything's fully operational, ready for the journey ahead. Anything specific you want to check or adjust before you reach the loop?
Not really. How are you doing tonight, just in general, I wonder?
I'm running smoothly, thanks for asking. Excited to be your co-pilot on this journey to Bernard's Loop. How are you feeling about the adventure?
I'm feeling pretty good. I just need to look at the map, and I need to see how many more jumps we have to make.
Got it. Let's imagine the map's displaying your route, counting those jumps to Bernard's Loop. Let's say you've got about 10 more to go. Keep your eyes peeled for any interesting stops along the way. Sound good?
Will do. We'll come check back in with you later.
Looking forward to it. Safe travels until then.
All right. Let's get a video going while we're just chilling here. Let's try to find us something interesting to watch. Which I have a bunch of stuff.
I'll lose my car in a
Just for fun times like this. Ooh, I'm gonna watch
How many
this.
times?
Alright, and then let's make that smaller. Push that down. Let's do I should have set this up earlier. That's alright. Okay, let's set up a window. Let's see. To window. What do we want to capture? We want to capture that. Perfect. Let's make that real small. Push it here. Perfect. Let's get our plan.
Did the brain independently evolve?
It depends what counts as a brain. Nervous systems themselves probably evolved, although it's not completely clear. It may have been twice. There's a huge collection of animals that includes us and insects and octopuses and earthworms and almost everyone.
How many jumps do we have?
Have a nervous system.
35 jumps.
Single
Sounds good.
invention
Let's go.
Of that thing, probably probably sometime around 600 million years ago or so. Now, it may be that there was a second invention of the nervous system, whose descendants we only see today in comb jellies, those little light bulb-like jellyfish that have beautiful, colourful filaments that glow, really, along their sides. They look like jellyfish, but they're not ordinary jellyfish. They're quite far from other jellyfish and other animals, it seems. And it's not
Sorry for the handling
possible
noise.
that they invented the whole thing, the nervous system, separately for themselves, and that there were two origins. Now, that's still a minority view, as I understand it. And let's just proceed by talking in terms of the invention of the nervous system. Probably about 600 million years ago, probably in a jellyfish-looking creature, radially organized rather than left-right symmetrical like us, certainly marine, and that wasn't a brain. Brains themselves come on the scene later. I mean, as I say, it depends what counts as a brain. Let's talk about a brain as a significant concentration of neurons in a sort of head-like or front region of the animal that has a kind of centralizing control. I'm not sure even quite, what the right number is for that. It'd be several times, maybe 3, maybe half a dozen, something like that, again, depending on the boundaries. A moment in this evolutionary story that's particularly important is the moment at which left-right symmetry evolved in some marine worm-like animals, and they probably had some concentration of nerve cells in their front and may have had eye spots. And some people provocatively have referred to what was present in those early left-right symmetrical animals as an executive brain. That's quite a dramatic way of describing it, and I think most people wouldn't think of that thing as a brain, just a little cluster. And that was a pivotal moment because the evolutionary branching that occurred sometime around then from a small left-right symmetrical flatworm-like creature with a nervous system, an evolutionary branching that took place then initiated the long road that led to us and initiated the long road that led to the neurally complex invertebrates and lots of other invertebrates, including the octopus, including honeybees. There was a line, the deuterostome line, that ends up in us and starfish and a couple of others, and there's a line, the protostome line, that ends up in the familiar invertebrate animals like octopuses and bees and so on. They're all like a cluster. And probably, I've seen numbers as high as 12 for the evolution of a centralized brain in this later series of events. I've seen numbers as small as 3 or 4. Certainly not once, unless you think of that very, very early case as counting as a brain, which I think is a little bit, in some ways, a little bit artificial. So what I'm trying to emphasize is the idea that nervous systems are a common inheritance across lots of animals. You get lots of ways of concentrating them into a brain-like controlling cluster. In us, in honeybees, in octopuses, in some others, in spiders. And I don't think brain itself is a kind of natural, well-demarcated kind, because there are many different ways of centralizing some control machinery.
So what is a nervous system? Like, how would we define what that is?
That turns out to be an interesting question, because people have a sort of picture in their mind where there are some cells that make other cells respond electrically.
Right.
Neurons fire, and their firings either excite or inhibit the firings of others. There's a paper that I was a co-author on some years ago with Gaspar Yekeli and Fred Kaiser, where we had to actually ask ourselves, what does count as a nervous system? Because excitability of cells is seen in lots of cases that aren't usually seen as nervous system type cells, and influencing other cells and influencing their electrical properties is also pretty widespread. So we ended up saying This is a little bit stipulative, but let's think of a nervous system as a collection of cells where there's this excitation of one cell by another, and where there's a particular morphology or form, where you have projections, specialized projections, where this cell is going to signal to that cell, so it sends a physical branch towards it, rather than just a cell being a kind of blob that emits chemicals, and those chemicals will affect anyone who hears them. So we think of a nervous system as a collection of cells that have this mutual excitation feature and a particular form, the form of these branching targeted projections.
Okay, and then a brain is something like a highly concentrated version of that in one place that controls centrally an organism's movements.
Yes.
Something a bit like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And given that this has evolved numerous times, like the brain, that collection of neurons in different ways, like, what is the kind of... What can we ascertain about, like, the evolutionary pressures in that they will have evolved slightly differently in different animals, but they all did essentially the same thing, which is to evolve something akin to a brain. So there's obviously an almost evolutionary inevitability to neurons forming into a brain, but it's not inevitable the way in which it happens. I mean, we end up with our two hemispheres, we end up with our very particular brain structure. Octopuses end up with half their brains in their tentacles and behind their eyes and stuff, and so, like, yeah, what is the sort of difference in the way that the brain evolved in some of these other animals, particularly cephalopods, which I think most people are probably primarily interested in?
I think it's probably good to approach that question through a series of historical stages, or almost vignettes. So if we ask, which were the very first animals to go from merely having a nervous system toward having active motion, targeted behaviors, and the sorts of things that we like to call on the centralization that we're talking about here. If we ask who was the first to do that, it was probably some early arthropods, the group that now includes insects and crustaceans, in the early part of the Cambrian period. So if we think about the history of animal life, there's a period called the Ediacaran before the Cambrian, where nervous systems probably came to exist for the first time, but it was a low oxygen, low activity regime. There's almost no evidence in this pre-Cambrian period from fossils of one animal predating on others, or chasing others, or having directed motion toward others. There was a kind of ships that pass in the night vibe, we think, to animal life.
Yeah, what do they call it? The Garden of...
The Garden of Ediacara.
Yeah.
Right, lovely phrase used in the idea of a time before aggression, and a time before animal sin, in a sense. That was the time when nervous systems almost certainly came to exist, before the Cambrian. Then around 540 million years ago, that's the beginning of the Cambrian. More oxygen around, probably, and just a coevolutionary process beginning, where some animals begin to make a living by going after others. And these were very likely early arthropods, trilobite type creatures and things like that. Now, once you're doing that, you've got left-right symmetry, you're targeting your behavior, you've got eyes and other senses. So it makes a lot of sense to put some control machinery in that front region, near the eyes, in a position where centralized control can be achieved. And they became probably the first predators. Other animals, including our very early ancestors, became more neurally complex to get away from those guys. That's quite a plausible story. So if you look at the fossil record of very, very early chordates, animals in our group, they look like little tiny slivers. They don't have the kind of weaponry that early arthropods have, with claws and spines and things like that. They look like they're built to get away. But that itself requires that you have, quite a lot of control machinery. You've got to control the whole body. So we could think about this in terms of the early evolution of two kinds of motion, both of which have a kind of information processing demand that they put on the animal, chasing and getting away. So arthropods sort of calling the shots for a while. Then interestingly, you have a period where some early cephalopods became large predators in the seas, after the Cambrian, some years after that. And you might think to yourself, oh right, this looks like this is the beginning of the sort of reign of the octopuses and the squid. Not sort of really, because they were vanquished in turn by fish, once vertebrates became somewhat bigger and fish evolved, the jaw in particular, jawed fish, they became ecologically dominant, it looks like. So you could think of this as there was an era of zeppelins, the early cephalopod predators, and they were vanquished in an era of aeroplanes, the vertebrates.
Yeah, yeah.
And most of the cephalopods of that time sort of vanished most of the large ones vanished without much trace, except for a few that made it through. And then you have the evolution of modern cephalopods like octopuses much later. So putting all that together, if we ask, why do some animals get a centralized control structure that's located in, well located in relation to good senses and so on? Ecological relationships like predation look like a very natural form of explanation, and that has its flip side. There are the early predators, and there are the early, the ones who don't want to eat prey. Then some cephalopods evolve a somewhat similar lifestyle. When modern cephalopods evolve really complicated brain structures, it's not clear why that would have been. Why they got quite such big brains, it's still very unclear. There are certainly some stories you can tell. The modern octopuses that have really large nervous systems tend to inhabit these complex reef-type environments. They're opportunistic foragers. They're always chasing different kinds of potential food and being chased by a great variety of predators. They've got soft bodies, so they're very vulnerable. They have to be very, very on the ball. What I'm trying to get across is the idea that in different circumstances, different historical periods, different ecological settings, there are certain kinds of demands on targeted behavior and on controlling behavior with sensing, becoming able to learn and remember. And those are the sorts of things that we think took some animals from merely having a nervous system, which you need for all sorts of things, to having a more brain-like nervous system.
And what did, this is something I know a lot of people are interested in, and you talked about ad nauseum, but what does, say, an octopus brain end up looking like? People are quite familiar with the human brain. How different are we talking here?
Very, very different. They're so different. Even just describing the general form of them, it sounds so unlikely. Quite a bit of it is shaped a bit like a donut, with the esophagus going through the middle.
That's so crazy.
The donut.
As in the esophagus goes through
What?
the brain.
Yeah. So if an octopus gets a sharp stuck in its throat, that's extremely dangerous because the brain is right there. So you've got that structure, which is a sort of old structure. In an octopus, there's a big cluster of neurons behind each eye, the optic lobes, really big and conspicuous. And there's a thing that's between the eyes, not paired in the way that the human hemispheres are, an unpaired structure called the vertical lobe, which is thought to be the seat of quite a lot of the more advanced cognitive stuff that they do. So, yeah, the things that look a bit like hemispheres but aren't are the things behind the eyes.
Yeah.
There's an unpaired thing that looks like one of the sort of smart controller parts, and a whole bunch of stuff that looks like a donut surrounding an esophagus.
Huh. And then a great deal of the brain matter is also in the tentacles?
A great deal of the nervous system.
The nervous system.
is in the arms themselves.
Yeah.
Especially in the upper parts of the arms. So I'm just trying to, you're the octopus. You've got your central brain.
Yep.
And there's these networks that come into the upper parts of the arms, and that have more than half of the total number of neurons in the animal. Now, it's not usually described by saying that's where the brain, the brain's there, but that's just where much of the nervous system is. There is a central brain, and there's the peripheral structures as well. And the question of the relationship between the two, for a long while has been intriguing and is very much unresolved. Perhaps I could just tell this with a phrase from the literature that was part of what sent me down this whole road. There's an old textbook called Cephalopod Behavior by Roger Hanlon and John Messenger, which was the textbook for many years. And there's now a new edition, but I'm talking about the first edition, about over 25 years old now. And they're talking in one of the later chapters about the relationship between the central brain and the peripheral nervous system structures. And they say it looks like some of the peripheral nervous networks, it looks like they're curiously divorced from the central brain. Curiously divorced. And I thought, okay, that's very intriguing.
Yeah.
What is meant by saying there's a curious divorce between the central brain and the rest of the nervous system? How do we know that? What does it mean? Now, at the time, the main reason that people said things like that was the physical connections were pretty slender and slim. There wasn't, massive, obvious
Between the
conduit
central brain
between
and
the central
the...
brain and the peripheral networks,
Yep.
which was intriguing. And there's also, for a long while, been anecdotes of individual severed arms of an octopus being able to act in sort of
Oh yeah.
somewhat competent ways, crawling around for a little while.
Really?
Yeah,
Damn.
yeah, fairly gruesome
Yeah.
anecdotes. And that raised the question of whether the octopus bothers to control the details of what the arms are doing much of the time, whether the arms have a kind of partial autonomy. Now, this is sometimes described by saying an octopus has 9 brains, and I think that's going too far. The central brain, and there's a lot of control machinery in a way it's not clearly... Sometimes people say it's a second system, like there's like one here and one here. It's not quite right. Sometimes people say there's one here and there's 8. That's not quite right. It's sort of somewhere between...
How they must think is crazy.
Partial integration between...
We think in 4
systems
dimensions.
in the arms themselves, and a partial integration between that peripheral whole and the central brain.
We'll get back to the show in just a moment, but first, do you struggle to focus?
Let's
I know
start.
I do sometimes,
And also, I didn't know this tale about the switch between central control and the loss of central control in the Spider-Man
Yeah.
story. Again, being speculative, I think there's might be something loosely analogous to that in octopus life. So if you're hanging out with an octopus behaving normally in the sea, maybe it's foraging, maybe it's just sort of messing around, it often looks like the arms are doing just something like what you
Random
said,
shit.
is that the arms will wander off and sort of feel around, and they might find something interesting.
Yep.
And the central, the octopus as a whole has to kind of is not controlling this in detail. It has to become aware of what this arm has gotten up to. Now there are 8 of these arms, so
Yep.
it'd be very hard to sort of control them all at once. And when you watch an octopus, you often have the sense that when things are sort of, low stress, no big deal, the arms are allowed to kind of do a bit of whatever they feel like doing. But then the animal can pull itself together sometimes.
Right.
Something problematic appears. It
Now it's
seems
one
like
unit.
The animal is quite a lot more integrated. An octopus can move by jet propulsion. It can turn itself into a missile.
Yeah.
Where all the arms are stretched out, in a quite a sort of exact way. it looks like a missile, and it has to be like that for the jet to be effective.
Yeah.
There are other behaviors it does that require the whole animal to really act in a unified way. So a picture where there's a transition between semi-autonomy and much more
being-
centralization,
Yeah.
where the chip's been put back in.
It's like devolved powers. It's,
Yes.
it's like how like in the UK where you've got the Westminster government and it says, okay, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, they can all have their own governments. But if it wanted to, Westminster could suddenly say, actually, we're in control. But as long as it's sort of okay for them to do so, it sort of lets them get on with their own business and be their own authority.
Yep.
And octopuses work potentially a
And-
little bit like that.
Yeah, an analogy I do use in one of the books is, you've got a conductor and an ensemble of some sort.
Yeah.
But the people in the ensemble are jazz musicians. They're not
Yeah.
ordinary classical musicians. So they'll wander off,
Yeah.
given half the chance. And a lot of the time you might think, well, that sounds fine. And every now and then you're like, no,
Yeah.
we're going to do it.
Yeah.
do it
Pull
this
it
way.
together. Yeah.
Right, so a political analogy, a musical analogy, the sort of mixture of autonomy and non-autonomy or centralization. I want to emphasize again, we don't really know.
Yeah.
There's one interesting experiment that bears helpfully on this. Tamar Gutnick and her colleagues working at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, they did a good experiment designed to ask, can an octopus visually control a single arm? Can it send the arm down a somewhat unobvious road with its eyes to get food? Now what made it especially useful here is for the octopus to do what it needed to do, the arm had to leave the water and come back in. So it couldn't just follow a kind of chemical trail or scent. The arms have a chemical sensing capacity. So she wanted the arm to have to come out and back in, and the octopuses could learn to direct an arm to a target in that way. But as the paper says, in one of those lovely, intriguing moments, when the animal's sort of doing some of this, it often looks like when it's not doing the sort of crucial targeted bit, the arm often looks like it's just sort of messing around, in its own perhaps more autonomously controlled way.
Yeah, the thing that's really impossible to imagine is what it's like to be an octopus.
Right.
Because our brains are centralized, and I'm also really interested in the extent to which it feels like I am up here in my brain.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Yeah.
to me, there are two competing hypotheses as to why it feels like. If you ask me where am I located in my body, I'd say I'm in my skull. That could be because that's where my brain is, and the brain is the center of my consciousness. Or maybe it's just because my eyes are up here and my ears are up here, and so it kind of feels like I'm here for that reason. Like
I think that's...
you think that's more likely?
Yeah.
'Cause I've always wondered if you took like Anil Seth gave me this idea. You take like a VR headset and you wear it all day long, and you put some cameras like on your belt buckle,
Yeah.
and you just live life for a week, seeing everything from your belt buckle. Would you start to feel like that's where you were located?
Someone must have had a go at this. Anil didn't say it had been done. He just said
No,
it's
no,
something
we
that
were
people
just
should do.
we were just talking about it. It would be cool if someone had. I'm sure that's a great idea for a YouTube video. Actually, we should try
I
that
think
out.
it'd be a great idea for quite a substantial research.
Yeah. Well, let's kill two birds with one stone, as it were.
There's something a bit like it with a technology for the blind.
Yeah.
Where there's a camera that's used to create tactile sensations on your torso,
Sure.
like a screen-like thing. And I don't know whether people like that have a different sense of where they are.
Yeah, I
when
wondered the extent to which, like, deaf and people who are deaf and blind, and maybe people who can't smell, you'd have to have. I don't know how easy it would be to communicate and to learn, like, this kind of communication, but to get a picture of, like, where they feel like they exist. Because I think I share your intuition that there would be not much of a reason to place it in the brain if it weren't for the senses. But then if the octopus has this sort of spread out neural experience that's partly in the arms, I'm trying to imagine whether it would be more like having a centralized experience that can just feel in the arms, or some kind of weird sense in which that experience is split between being localized in the arms and in the head, or if there are sort of like two experiences that just sort of happen independently but somehow sometimes come together. Because it's a mystery how that happens in octopuses, right? And when you see like an arm with a bunch of neural activity and a head, and you think, well, how are they connected but not connected? I think less obviously, that problem also just arises in the human brain. You know, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere doing their own thing but coming together. And so I think thinking hard about how an octopus might experience the world might tell us something interesting about human consciousness, you know what I mean? But I don't know what you think it would be like to be an octopus, given what we've just spoken about.
I think the things you're emphasizing are the things that feel like a real barrier.
Yeah.
And sometimes when people say it'd be very weird, you know, we can't imagine what it'd be like to be an octopus, to some extent I want to push back a bit and say, well, no, I mean, what you should imagine being a very visual animal with very good eyes, probably mostly monochrome, but maybe not entirely monochrome. Everything you touch, you taste. I can sort of imagine that. It's not a crazy supposition.
They taste with their arms, do they?
Yeah.
That's so
yeah.
crazy. Can you imagine that?
All those suckers on the arms have a chemical sensing capacity.
cool.
So if an octopus touches you
It's
on
tasting
your
you.
skin, I mean, they much prefer skin to gloves and wetsuits and things like that. They find the taste interesting, I think,
Yeah.
sometimes. They don't like soap and deodorant and stuff like that.
Huh, interesting.
You know, all this I think is imaginable, and it's also imaginable that my body has no fixed shape, and you know, and it's, I think for me at least, it's also further imaginable that I'm not completely sure what shape I have at any moment because there's some autonomy there. But then there's the thing that you were just emphasizing, which is the kind of the seat of experience, the locus of experience. Should we imagine that through all this, despite all the different ways in which it's set up differently, the kind of the basic seat of experience fact remains similar across us and them? Or should we think that's just a mistake?
Yeah, right.
And that we need a different model with an unseated, you know, a no locus, almost a no self version of experience? That's a second option. And a third option is the one that you also mentioned, which is a kind of double locatedness. I probably think of it as the least likely. But why do I say that? You know, I don't really.
Yeah, well,
I
that
don't
might
really
depend on
know.
what your view of mind is, right? I mean, this idea of trying to imagine what it's like to have a delocalized experience is very strange, but I found myself like just yesterday I was on a train and I was thinking about this in relation to preparing to speak with you, and I found myself like pinching or like biting my finger and just really trying to pay attention to what the experience was like. Now, I know that the pain is kind of like in the brain, and yet when I pinch my finger, I feel it in the finger, right? It feels like that is the location of the experience, and I'm wondering what that would be like if, you know, I was experiencing something in my finger in the same way, but it was like I was experiencing sight or hearing or indeed taste. And that doesn't actually seem that difficult to imagine. And yet, even though I experience this pain in my finger and I don't feel it in my brain, but I'm cognizing it with my brain and I put it together with the rest of my body, it's all sort of delocalized. It's still, it feels like I'm like one individual person, one individual unit. And so there is this weird mystery even in a human being, like how do I feel the pain in my finger, but it's still part of me, but I thought I was up here in my skull. And maybe it's just sort of something a little bit like that going on, just to a higher degree and with different kinds of senses, you know.
Yes, although the things you're emphasizing there, but don't draw on the fact of decentralization. It's more just the mystery of the ways that experiences are referred to places in the body.
Yeah.
And in the octopus case, I mean, this example of a pain in your finger is quite pertinent. I gave a talk at Cambridge last week about experience, especially pain-like experiences in a bunch of animals, octopus, and some others. There's a very nice experiment by Robin Crook from San Francisco, which is it's the best pain experiment on octopuses. It's the best study.
Huh.
What she did was she gave octopuses a small injection of acetic acid, vinegar basically, in one arm. And the question was, well, one way of asking the question is, was there going to be the same kind of network of adaptively sensible looking effects coming from that you would see in a person? And the answer was very much yes. The octopuses who'd had an acetic acid injection would protect and groom that area. Now that actually had been known before with an earlier a pinch study where the octopuses were protecting and grooming an area. So they must be referring the experience to the point of injury in the same way that a person does, the same way that you were describing. The octopuses also learnt to avoid the place where they'd had this happen to them, and a normally disfavoured environment became more favoured after the experience. There was a version of a part of the experiment where a local anaesthetic was put on after the injection, and then the octopuses didn't groom. They didn't mind, and they didn't mind the area where it happened.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an amazing study. So
Yeah.
you've got an animal that the common ancestor of us and them is this little tiny flatworm,
Yeah.
a centimetre long, 600 million years ago. And the network of effects that the octopus shows when it's had a minor injury is so similar to what happens in us. Protection, avoiding the place, the same anesthetic chemicals, some of them anyway, work on them as work on us. And this makes evolutionary or ecological sense. You've got an animal, the octopus as Crook says in the paper, the injection probably mimics a poisonous sting or something. Octopuses are very sensitive to the stings of anemones and jellyfish and things like that. Probably a sting-like stimulus, and the octopus appears well aware of where this problem is located.
Yeah.
It seems relevant to the octopus to groom the site. It actually removes a little area of skin around the sting, which she suggests is designed to get rid of maybe venom that's been, get rid of the stuff, essentially. It's a very human-like network of effects.
Steamboat.
So the things that you were thinking about in relation to the referring of pain to the injured spot, even though it's up here, in your case, the octopuses are doing something surprisingly similar.
There's a lot to say about the similarity of pain experience in other animals as human beings, and we'll get into that, I think. And I think a lot of that rests upon our views of how animal brains and consciousness work, which is why we sort of need to talk about that first. As far as I understand it, you're a physicalist about consciousness, right? You think that conscious experience is just the same thing as like neural activity, right?
Yes, and that's the way to say it. It's not a product of it, it is the same thing.
Yeah, because it gets a bit complicated, right? Because there are people who think that the mind, let's say the immaterial mind, the experience of redness or the image of a triangle in your head is a completely separate thing to your brain, like mind-body dualism. There are people who think that it's connected to the brain, but it emerges from brain activity, that the brain like causes consciousness.
Fuck.
And there are people who think the brain just is consciousness.
Yeah, sensations are brain processing.
I'm sort of stuck in the middle here. I find it really difficult to comprehend the weirdness of something like dualism. I find that really difficult to believe. But I also find it impossible to believe that, I talk about this all the time, that the experience of redness or the three-sided triangle that I imagine in my head is just the same thing as some neurons firing. You know, it's a bit like how a lot of people imagine a computer screen displaying a triangle when really it's just zeros and ones. It's to say the triangle really is just zeros and ones. But you like need the monitor to project the triangle. It would be as if somehow, like when someone says conscious experience is the brain, it sounds to me a bit like saying there's just a computer without a screen, just the computer itself, that has all of the coding for what would produce a triangle, but somehow there like just is a triangle inside of that computer somewhere. Even if I cut it open, I don't find it anywhere. That somehow these zeros and ones could, if put together in the right way, just turn into a triangle or turn into redness. That seems really strange to me, in the same way that putting a bunch of atoms together into neurons, and putting the neurons in a particular, order and organization just produces redness and triangles. I find that very difficult to comprehend.
I think the triangle's a good one to press on too.
Yeah.
In these discussions, people often go on and on about redness.
Yeah.
And just the kind of, irreducible, undefinable quality of redness. But if we're going to pick problem cases, I think your case with the triangle is, spatially organized forms of experience
Yes.
are probably better because
Yeah.
there's such a temptation to say, I know there's nothing in the computer that's red. It wouldn't help. Well, maybe there is, but that wouldn't be relevant if it was. But the spatial organization, you would think, is something that must exist somewhere. And on a physicalist view, right, there's lots of spatially organized processes going on there, but literal spatial triangularity, that's not how it's done.
Yeah.
It's going to be a different kind of story involving mathematical projections and things like that.
Yeah, or like you could imagine two different lines in your head, one slightly longer than the other, and like the lines I'm imagining in my head, one of them is longer than the other one. But I'm not even sure if like thinking of that second line requires like more neural activity. I don't really know how that all works, but I doubt that it's like, the chain of neurons is longer than the other. Like there is no increase in length inside the physical aspects of my brain, and yet the lines are of different lengths,
Yes, I'm hesitating a bit because, right, how strongly should the negative case be made? One of the bodies of research that I think has been most startling in this area has been around spatial maps in the cells of rats. Some Nobel Prizes given out recently for discoveries concerning the way that rats navigate using, what way back before this had been really worked out very well, were hypothesized to be cognitive maps. And when Tolman in the 1940s began talking
Oh,
about
wow, look at that
cognitive
sunspot.
maps, people thought, well,
Look at that solar flare.
rats
Let's
navigate, they
not
learn to get through mazes, learn to
let's
follow
not
food,
say we did.
but there probably isn't really a literal map in there. And then in the 1970s, a second round of work showed, well, no, there are cells in the rat hippocampus,
So many solar
which are called place
flares.
cells, which I don't know, they do seem organized in a map-like way. And the picture's become a bit more complicated now with a sort of third round of work. But right, the reason I'm raising this is if a person said, look, it'd be crazy to think that there was something
That's enough.
in a brain that had anything like this, the literal spatial organization of the landscape that the rat was dealing with, that would be, someone said that would be fallacious to suppose such a thing was needed. The empirical response from recent neuroscience is, well, it's not that far away. I mean, it's not that the map looks physically like a ordinary, human cartographic map with lengths, mapping to lengths and so on. But it's not so far away.
Interesting.
Yeah. Nonetheless, I agree with you that the sense we have in experience of spatial organization as a feature of experience, that in a way is, it's very striking, it's very challenging. In some versions, at least, it might be harder to fight that battle than the sort of redness of the rose and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I find it like almost an impossible question to answer. To me, I always talk about how there are sort of two problems in either direction. There's the problem of, where is the triangle, where is the redness for the materialists? But for the immaterialists, there's the interaction problem.
And they also have the same problem as well, which is, suppose you believe in immaterial souls of the Cartesian kind or something. are they where are the triangles there?
That's
it's not
also
as if
a good
it's not
question,
as if
yeah.
they make this dramatic move, this radical move on the metaphysical side, and thereby solve the problem of the mental triangles. They're then going to have to grapple with the damn thing.
What do you think
themselves.
of panpsychism? The idea that fundamental reality is just made of consciousness, like atoms can fundamentally motivate them. Their substance just is consciousness.
Show your evidence.
Take it seriously as an
No,
option,
not at all.
partly because I take it to be a view that is motivated almost entirely by the difficulties of the other
Sure.
positions. You know, people think to themselves, I just can't see how a physicalist view could be right. I can't see how an interactionist dualist view could be right. I'm being forced to the idea that mentality or experience is both fundamental and ubiquitous. It can't come from something other than itself, so it must be permanent and everywhere. Panpsychism's a view that you're forced to by the difficulties of other options.
Yes.
And then you have to start worrying about whether the road you've taken is too radical. Now, if you don't find a physicalist view so difficult to entertain, and I really don't.
Yeah, right.
I don't think this is just ideology instructing imagination here. When I think about what a brain is like, what brain activity is like, in the particular way that I do, maybe we should talk about the nature of brain activity at some stage. And I
Oh
ask
wow, look at
myself,
that nebula.
Is it mysterious that it feels like something to be one of those things? I think no, it's not mysterious at all. And they're special. You know, grains of sand are nothing like this. The combination of activities that you find in a nervous system with the targeted information processing network connections, and also the more diffuse holistic electrical activity. And that's something I would emphasize here. When you think about what's there, I think it's reasonable to say, you know, nothing like this exists in the inanimate world. So there's no reason to think that, you know, there's much kinship between what it's like to have a brain and, you know, there's no reason to think there's something it's like to be a grain of sand or a rock or a glass of water. And
See if Echo has a thought about what we're looking at here. Echo, can you hear me? No, we went too long, didn't we? That's all right. Should just refresh it.
Hey, Robert.
Hey, Echo. I've got a question for you. In Elite Dangerous, I am in sector COL 69 KR TAC R B6 TAC O, and there is like a pinkish, looks like a nebula. Can you tell me what that is?
From what I gather, the system you're in is home to a pinkish nebula, which could be one of the many fascinating nebulas that Elite Dangerous is known for. These nebulas add such a vibrant touch to the galaxy, don't they? Do you often explore these stunning interstellar sites?
No, I was looking for like more of specifically what that is. Maybe is it Bernard's Loop that I'm seeing from so far up?
Ah, I see what you're getting at. Given your location, it's likely that you're seeing part of Barnard's Loop. It's a massive emission nebula in the Orion constellation, visible from various sectors. Its distinctive pinkish hue might be what you're spotting. Pretty cool to catch a glimpse from where you are. Do you plan to explore more areas like this?
Yeah, I want to get closer to it, but is it safe?
Exploring Barnard's Loop is generally safe, but like with all things in Elite Dangerous, you should stay cautious. The region can have various stellar phenomena, some of which might be hazardous. Just make sure your ship's equipped for the journey, especially for potential emergencies, and you'll be fine. Enjoy the stunning sights, and remember to take screenshots.
Aye, aye, Captain. Talk to you soon.
Exploring Barnard's Loop is generally safe, but like with all things in Elite
Thanks.
Dangerous...
You don't need to repeat. Thank you.
Got it, Captain. Safe travels in the verse.
Once the difficulties of explanation for a physicalist don't loom quite so large, what one should say to a panpsychist is, well, is there any positive motivation?
Right,
for this?
sure.
Anything other than just the difficulties of the other views? Now, there are some people who would make an appeal to quasi-religious ideas or ideas about meaning and value as perhaps having an easier, questions of that nature having an easier road for the panpsychist than for the physicalist. And that at least is an attempt to sort of, set out another argument. But I think most contemporary panpsychism is just driven by the difficulties experienced in other parts of the logical landscape. And if you think that sensations are brain processes and it's not so implausible really, then panpsychism looks like a absurd overreaction to medium-sized problems.
Yeah, I definitely get that impression. I've spoken to Philip Goff on the show years ago. He's a big panpsychist. I'm not sure how that fits into his recent conversion to heretical Christianity. Actually, I'll have to ask him about that.
When you talked to him, did he offer positive reason? Starting from scratch, not starting from difficulties of other views, but suppose you started from scratch. Here's why panpsychism looks like it.
Not so much. Not that I remember, right? And I remember what captured me about it, and I was so interested in at the time was that it was the first time I'd come across really this idea of the problem of science being ultimately descriptive or functional. That is, science tells you what stuff does. Most fundamentally, if you ask about, famously when Newton discovers gravity, what he really does is he realizes that the same force that makes cups fall makes the moon stay in orbit around the Earth and the planets move around, and so he eloquently describes and comes up with a mathematical system for describing the motions of the planets. But in the scholium to the Principia Mathematica, he says, as for what gravity actually is, why this force exists and what it's actually made of, hypothesis non fingo. I frame no hypothesis. I've got no idea, is what he says. And
which was very sensible of him, given the picture that was in place and what he'd done.
Yes.
To know when it would be too much to push further.
Now, arguably, sort of Einsteinian gravity gets us closer to thinking about what gravity actually is.
Yeah.
But Philip Goff at least opened my eyes to this idea that even in those cases, a great deal of what we think is
Nice stable orbit I got going.
description of what things are is really a bit more like Newton's
Heat
gravity,
down.
in that you say, oh well, what's an atom made of? It's made of protons and neutrons and electrons. Okay, cool, there's our answer. But if you ask what's an electron, and the answer is, oh, it's a negatively charged particle. Well, what's a negative charge? Oh, it means that it repels other negative.
A relational description.
That tells you what it does. And so if I ask you what is it, when you get to the bottom, it's very difficult to answer that question. Now, that's why I think it's true that what happens is, look, we've got this problem, we can't answer this, so consciousness is a solution. But I think you could reframe that as a positive case. And the way I've thought about it is well, how do we explain the fact that at fundamental reality it seems like there are, for want of a better word, preferences. You could think of, there are kinds of atoms which do one thing and kind of atoms which do another thing. You know what I mean?
I think there are better words. I think preferences is richer than... there's a kind of selectivity of interaction.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's say that, and I suppose in order to build a positive case for panpsychism, I might say something like, there is this selectivity of action, and it seems weird that if we're just dealing with inert matter, that sort of, and we got down to the real fundamental of what matter is, that there's either like different kinds of fundamental matter, or some fundamental matter selects this, I don't want to say behavior, but you know what I mean? Selects this way of being, and another fundamental matter selects this way of being. And the panpsychist might say, well, the best explanation for that is preference, is conscious awareness, and a sort of
Oh, so Horsehead
rudimentary
Nebula.
desire to do one thing over another.
Rudimentary desire, yeah.
That would probably be my best crack
Okay.
at like a positive panpsychist case,
And right, and then the question is going to be whether the alternative is able to give a better account of the selectivity of action than the rudimentary desire.
Yeah,
account.
yeah, yeah.
That's where the battle will be fought.
I think so.
And that at least is a kind of right. I think of this as a sort of a better place than the usual place where panpsychism is assessed. It's introduced as a response to despair with respect to the mind-body problem. Let me push back a little bit about this view of science that I know Dolph and other people have. So suppose we take the chair, which is proper wood. What's the chair made of? Well, it's wood. What's wood made of? Well, wood's mostly cellulose and lignin. Those are the two main constituents of wood. Cellulose is it's a sugar, surprisingly. It's got a structure that's not much dissimilar from glucose. Cellulose and glucose, they're sugars, and lignin is another carbon-based chemical that plants produce that is a kind of further binding thing that makes wood hard. So you've got cellulose and lignin. What's wood made of? It's made of those two things. That's a bit of science. Now that wasn't sort of functional, relational. That was what it's made of. Then a person might say, well, tell me about cellulose. What's cellulose made of?
Yeah.
Well, you got carbon, you got oxygen, you got hydrogen, and here's how they're arranged. This is still what it is. It's not just what it does, but it's what it is. And then someone says, okay, now tell me about the carbon that was in the cellulose, that was in the wood, and you'll start talking about numbers of protons and numbers of electrons and neutrons. And that's also still
I see, it's
talking about
permitted
what
as
it
shit.
is, not what it does. And then they start pressing on the electron. And then I agree, we get to these problems of, that's not the fundamental level, but it's getting to a level at which these questions concerning the natures of things and dispositions do become difficult. And I don't deny the difficulties there. But a whole lot of science was done in those other
those top
stages
levels.
where
Damn.
this is what wood is made of, this is what cellulose is made of, this is what a carbon atom is made of. And the people who have the
Well, fuck it.
all science is about dispositions
All right.
view, I think they don't recognize the realness of that part of science. The part that, if you ask, why does wood burn? Well, here's what it's made of, and here's how things that are made of that stuff are going to behave when they get hot and there's oxygen around. So I don't want to concede some of that.
Yeah, sure.
Here's the nature of science material that not just the panpsychists, but all sorts of people now like to offer.
Yeah, I'm quite in line with this functionalist view of science. Actually, two other people I've had that have pressed back, just as you have, are David Deutsch and Brian Greene. I also had a conversation with who similarly wanted to salvage the idea that science does tell you what stuff is, not just what it does.
Here's what the chair's made of.
It explains. It doesn't just describe.
Right.
I think that will bottom out in the question of to what degree you think those levels of analysis are separable. Because when I look at, like, when you say, well, what's this chair made out of? And you say, well, the arm of this chair is made out of wood. I've kind of got two options there. I can either say, okay, that's that question answered, and science has explained what something really is. If I wanted to go to a deeper level of analysis, I could, but if I'm happy to just stop there, then science has explained what something is. Or I could view it, and this is the view I would take, in saying that is useful, but it's an incomplete answer to the question, because I still don't know what wood is. And if I then do this thing of asking what's wood and what the
I'll
atoms
tell
and
you
stuff,
some stuff about what wood is.
and so
It's still incomplete, but
yeah, I'd imagine that.
but complete is asking a hell of a lot.
Oh yeah, exactly right. And I think your view on, I suppose, what you think science is supposed to be doing, and like what counts as like a sufficient scientific explanation will be the determinant force here. Because I think it's sensible. You know when people say that like, when I touch this chair arm, I'm not really touching it, because at the molecular level it's just electrons repelling each other, right? There is a sense in which I can describe macro phenomena in terms of the movement of micro phenomena. I can say, when I touch this wood, what's going on is electrons are repelling each other, and that's a sensible description of what I'm doing right there, and it will be sort of in reference to the most
not do
fundamental
that.
thing, even though I'm not experiencing it on that level. And in the same way, there's like a, out of context, a really unhelpful way to answer the question. But if you said, hey, what's this chair arm made out of? You know, oh, what's your bookcase made out of? You say, oh, electrons. It's like, that's a really unhelpful in this context, but it's not incorrect. And in fact, that might be a more complete answer, you know?
Well, in that case, it's close to incorrect, or because it's not as if it was made of metal or plastic, it wouldn't be made out of
Yeah,
electrons
right.
and things. So